Brazilian indigenous people are under threat today because some of their territories haven't been recognized yet. As soon as we start organizing ourselves to fight for our land, the big landowners hire gunmen and try to do everything to stop us.
Brazil's indigenous people feel under threat. But in a rare victory, the country's top court struck down a state's request for compensation for land given to tribes. But indigenous communities say their fight is far from over as they continue to resist attempts to force them off their land. Indigenous people make up less than 1% of the Brazilian population, but their territories cover around 13% of the country. Critics say that's too much land for too few people and argue it prevents economic development and progress. Brazil's constitution recognizes tribal ownership of traditional land, but the Supreme Court postponed ruling on a controversial case that seeks to reinterpret tribal borders in a process known as demarcation. The government is pushing to restrict their lands to only territory used by indigenous communities up until 1988. That's despite the fact that many tribes had been forced off their land long before then during the military dictatorship in the 1960s and 70s. Well, I'm joined now from Malaga in Spain by Francisco Dominguez. He is the head of the Latin American Studies Research Group at Middlesex University and the co-author of Right-Wing Politics in the New Latin America. Francisco, thanks so much for joining us. First of all, tell me if you see this latest ruling as a victory for Brazil's indigenous tribes, or do you just see too many challenges still to come?
I think it's a victory in the sense that the government was trying to get a legal opinion so that indigenous people who are not living in particular lands before 1985, that is to say before the current constitution, then they would not be entitled to live there. That was defeated. And the ruling by the Supreme Court is unanimous. That is to say, all the judges voted in favor of the indigenous lands rights, which is a significant victory, particularly in the current context. But it seems to me there is a huge amount that still have to go through in order for them to get the land that already been demarcated. But the government and various vested interests refuse to comply with the existing law.
Because they really are up against the interests of farmers and a number of politicians who believe that this land is better served for agriculture or development to serve the greater good of Brazil.
There is a sort of Occidental, I would say, view of it. They are seen, unfortunately, by many, particularly by agribusiness, who are really greedy for land. They are seen as an obstacle to be removed so that economic growth, economic development, and wealth can be created. But they've been there, for hundreds and hundreds of years. I think it's an ethical problem. There is plenty of land in Brazil for the indigenous population and themselves. In fact, the lands that have been demarcated, recognized as their ancestral land, is a very small proportion of the land that exists in the country. Agribusiness can easily coexist with them, but they are so greedy that they are prepared to go against them. And they are normally attacked by people, hitmen who assassinate them, push them out of their land, and violence is used against them. And unfortunately, most of the authorities at the local level tend to be complicit in these activities against them.
So are you entirely in favor of protecting indigenous rights at all costs, let's say it like that, or is there a better balance actually to be found so that land can be used more productively by people who can serve the greater good of Brazil, and while ensuring indigenous rights and lands are still protected?
Well, provided that the principle, which is stipulated in the Constitution, that given that these are their ancestral lands, whatever development may take place is negotiated with them and they finally agree to it. Out of which, whatever possible development might take place in a particular land, actually they are compensated for it. What tends to happen is that vested interests, particularly agribusiness, as I said, tend to just use violence, which is completely unacceptable. I'm sure that the indigenous communities, and I've talked to several of them myself, are quite prepared to negotiate and to talk about possibilities of development that would benefit not only the greater good, but also themselves.
Do you fear now that that violence you say is being used against the indigenous people will actually increase?
I think it's likely because the political context in Brazil right now by the de facto Temer government has created a context within which forces of the state and vested interests have been used their power against everybody, social movements, trade unions, and so on. And given that the indigenous population in Brazil is a very small minority, I'm sure they would use everything they have in their power against them, particularly because they tend to live in remote areas where nobody knows what happens except much later after the event has taken place. And it works to the advantage of those who want their land.
And what do you make of Michel Temer, the current president in particular? Some say he has ulterior motives here because he has corporate interests personally involved. And also there's the issue that he might not be, given Brazil's current political climate, in office too much longer.
I think the reason why the Congress voted to sustain him by 174 votes against 136 recently, more than a week ago, was because many of them actually are the target of investigation for corruption. And they believed, I think, that if they had allowed him to fall at that particular point in time, then many of them would have been threatened by investigations themselves. They decided to sustain him for the time being until they find a way out of the crisis they find themselves in. Temer enjoys something like between 2 to 4 to 6% of rate of approval, one of the lowest, not only in Brazil historically, but also in the world. So I don't think he's going to survive too much longer. But the key remains in the hands of the politicians in the Congress and in the Senate. And so far, they've been unwilling to actually go for the last push, which I think they should do in order to open up the possibilities of that country, which at the moment have been, blocked.
Okay, Francisco Dominguez, we will leave it there. Thank you so much for joining us on the Newsmakers.